Alright, next we're going to tie a really good crab pattern. This is a raghead crab, or what I refer to as the easy raghead, or ER crab. This is an old Florida Keys pattern for permit and bonefish, and we've just made this a little bit quicker, a little bit easier to tie than the original. We're going to use SC15. This is a 1/0 hook. So we're going to tie a little bit bigger crab. Also like tying this on a 1. These are short shanks, so it's the equivalent of 2 and 4. And you can even go down in size from that for little bonefish crabs. They really work well for bonefish as well. First thing I do is just take, before we even attach the thread, just put a little bit of Zap-A-Gap on the shank. And going to take some lead wire, some 020 diameter lead wire, and just give that whole shank a coat of lead over top of that Zap-A-Gap. And once that dries, it is not moving ever again. Really nice quick platform for attaching lead to a hook with some Zap-A-Gap. And next, just take and give that entire lead shank a coat of thread just to change the color of it. It'll kind of show through the body. The other thing that lead does, obviously besides make it heavier, which is usually a good thing for a permit crab, gives you a really nice platform, thicker diameter, to put on a set of lead eyes. Takes a lot less thread wraps with that bigger diameter to really secure those lead eyes. So a couple figure eights, douse that with some Zap-A-Gap. And then we're going to go up and over. Not a lot of tension at first, and progressively, as we build that thread, get tighter with those wraps. And then we're going to go around those wraps. Not around the shank, but around just underneath the eyes. And before we pull that real tight and that glue dries, just want to make sure that we're perfectly level and perpendicular with those lead eyes to the hook shank. And once that Zap-A-Gap dries, those lead eyes, if you do it properly with Zap-A-Gap, become very difficult to turn. Really need to be forced to move. Okay, next thing we're going to do is pick out a marabou plume, kind of more of the woolly bugger type marabou that has maybe a little bit more width in the fibers towards the tip. I'm just going to use a partial, just use the tip of it. We don't need a ton of it. Maybe about a shank length, right above the barb. Trim off that excess. And it doesn't really matter what we do on this thread. It does not need to be neat. It is all going to be covered up with the last step, the shell. So don't waste a ton of time, making that part of the fly look pretty. Next, we're going to take some crystal flash, just a little bit. Maybe take 2 long fibers, trim them in half, and then wrap those around the thread. Grab both ends of them, place them right on top, and wind them on. Trim that even with the marabou. Next, we're going to take some rooster hackles. I usually try and use the short ones that you don't really use for anything else on the sides here. and grab a pair of those. And I'm not going to do anything as far as preparing them other than just put them right on the sides, maybe a little bit longer than the marabou. Loose wrap all the way around, maybe 2 of them. Don't put a ton of pressure on that thread until you get a bunch of wraps on there. Otherwise, they'll have the tendency to roll on you. Do one on one side, one on the other. Don't pull that thread real tight here, otherwise those feathers might spaz out on you a little bit. And ideally, you tie those in so they kind of flare a bit out to the side. Next, we're going to just take some white round rubber legs. You can use any color you want to. We're going to tie kind of a light colored crab. And this is maybe almost 3 inches in length. And we're going to take 3 of those rubber legs. You don't have to separate them, just a strip of 3. Going to move the thread right up up towards the eye of the hook. And just with kind of a figure 8 or 2, just place those right on the hook. A couple of wraps. If one's too long, you can adjust them a little bit. Make sure they're even. And then I'm just going to go ahead and throw a half hitch on there right in the middle and trim my thread. Next step, we're going to take some furry foam, and for a crab this size we need about a dime size square. And you'll notice that this furry foam, it's fuzzy on 2 sides, and then there's a layer of open cell foam kind of in the middle. And if you carefully peel it apart without tearing it, you get 2 pretty thin pieces, about so. Now, I'm going to take that and just trim it into just a round shape. You can experiment with different shapes if you want to. We'll just do kind of a round one. You can also use a dime as a guide. If you're doing a whole bunch of these at once, you can just use a dime and do a couple of bodies at a time, just as a template. Just like that. Now we've got 2 pieces exactly the same shape. Put those aside for a second. Next, we're going to take some Zap Goo and put a pretty good amount on the top. I'm going to flip it over and put a pretty good amount on the bottom. Just let that set up for just a second. And then I'm going to take one of those pieces of furry foam and just kind of stick it right on top. Now we've got that big bead of Zap Goo there, and I'm just going to spread that around. You want to get it all over that furry foam, all the way to the edge, up on top of the feathers and marabou a little bit, on the eyes. It's better to use a little bit too much than not enough. And then I'm going to take that second piece and just put that on top and just kind of start pinching it like so. Next, I'm going to separate those rubber legs. And then just before you really seal that glue in those two pieces of furry foam, just position these legs however you want them. I usually kind of point them back a little bit. And once you get them where you want to, then you just give that furry foam a squeeze until you get the glue coming out all the edges. If you use a little bit too much, you can wipe it away with a bodkin. You can trim it later with scissors. And just spend a little bit of time making sure it's nice and even, nice and flat. And then when you get it to this point, you're essentially done. Just let this thing dry for, at least 24 hours before you put it in your box and and fish it. And once that zap goo dries, it becomes rigid but flexible, and that's a really good thing for a permit crab.